It arrived so late that most of the palace had already gone quiet for the night. One message, sent from across the Atlantic, urgent and tightly drawn, timed with such precision that nobody could mistake it for an accident. Prince Harry was asking for something he had never asked for before, and he wanted an answer fast. But the request never reached the desk the way it was supposed to. Because before Charles could even respond, a second document made its way into the room. Not from Harry. Not from the legal team. From Sophie, the late Queen's most trusted companion, who carried an envelope that had been sealed years earlier under circumstances only one woman could have arranged. Within minutes, the request was frozen. The temperature inside Windsor dropped. And the story that would dominate headlines for days had already begun, long before anyone outside those walls knew it existed. According to reports from people connected to the situation, this was never a casual favor between relatives. Harry wanted temporary access to unreleased Platinum Jubilee footage and private correspondence, so that selected material could become part of a personal commemorative film. Not a documentary. Not an interview-driven project. A tribute to his grandmother. The Royal Archives hold the monarchy's official record: papers, photographs, recordings, correspondence, the collected evidence of a reign. And within that collection sat material from Elizabeth's final Jubilee year that the public had never seen. To Harry, those files held something irreplaceable. To the palace, they held something dangerous. Because once private memories leave royal custody, nobody gets to decide where they end up. Not the family. Not the crown. No one. Charles opened the sealed envelope and read in silence. Those in the room later described the moment as the point where the atmosphere changed. Halfway down the first page, something shifted in his expression. He placed Harry's application beside the document and simply stopped moving. Sophie remained standing across from him, carrying the weight of a secret she had hoped never to use. She understood exactly what that paper could do to Harry. She also understood why the Queen had trusted her with it. And in that understanding lay a silence heavier than any argument either man could have made. The directive was precise. Unpublished Jubilee material involving private family exchanges had to remain under royal custodial control. It could not be released for an independently produced personal project without specific Crown authorization. Crown authorization, in plain terms, meant formal approval granted under the monarch's authority before restricted material could be used beyond its protected setting. There was almost no room for interpretation. Charles drew the request back toward himself, closed the folder, set down his pen, and ordered the approval process stopped immediately. No footage would leave the archive. No private correspondence would be copied. No exception would be made, even for his own son. But Sophie didn't look relieved, and neither did he. Because then Charles noticed something lower on the page. He read it twice before lifting his eyes toward her. The Queen had not simply protected the archive. She had anticipated a future in which a request arrived driven by urgency, emotion, and family pressure. Charles asked why his mother had prepared for this exact possibility. And the answer Sophie gave would carry the conflict far beyond a sealed document. Behind that paper stood three people carrying three very different wounds. Harry saw the request as a way back to his grandmother. Charles saw another decision capable of pushing father and son further apart. And Sophie stood between them, holding instructions from a woman neither man could question anymore. Suddenly, the dispute was no longer about archive access. It was about trust. About grief. About loyalty. And about who had the right to guard the private world of the Queen. Harry did not think of his planned film as another public project. To him, it was deeply personal. The official Jubilee footage showed the monarch, polished and ceremonial. The private recordings showed the grandmother he remembered, the woman behind the crown. The Platinum Jubilee marked 70 years of Elizabeth's reign, but inside the family, it also became one of the final chapters of her life. That made the restricted material valuable in a way no broadcast could ever replace. And Sophie understood that difference better than most. She had been close to the Queen in her later years. Her authority in that room came not from constitutional power, but from trust. She had arrived with a promise. And when she explained, through a documented private account, that Elizabeth had told her to produce the directive only if private Jubilee material was ever sought for use beyond palace custody, Charles suddenly understood why she had waited until this exact moment. Harry, at first, believed the refusal was procedural. He expected another review, perhaps another conversation. Then he was told that Sophie had produced a sealed instruction from the Queen. His frustration changed immediately. The Duke of Sussex, who had watched formalities swallow 100 family conversations before, realized that someone inside his own family had been holding a document capable of stopping his request before he had even made his case. What had felt like bureaucracy suddenly felt personal. Charles felt the same wound from the opposite direction. Left alone for several minutes, he pressed his fingers against the closed folder and admitted quietly to an aide that refusing the Duke sounded simple when written down as official business. Refusing his own son was something else entirely. He feared another rejection would deepen a distance already shaped by years of pain. But ignoring Elizabeth's wishes would mean breaking faith with the very woman whose memory Harry claimed he wanted to honor. Sophie then revealed the second safeguard. The directive demanded more than royal approval. It required confirmation that every private family member shown or discussed would remain protected. That single condition made Harry's request nearly impossible to approve. He did not withdraw it. Instead, he asked to speak directly with his father. And the question he intended to ask would cut deeper than any archive rule. Was Charles truly obeying the Queen, or simply using her final instructions to justify a decision he had already made? Sophie's account carried Charles back to the moment when the problem had first taken shape. The crisis had not begun with Harry's request. It had begun years earlier, during celebrations meant to symbolize unity, loyalty, and national pride. The Platinum Jubilee had generated an extraordinary record of Elizabeth's final great celebration: speeches, family messages, photographs, personal recordings, private correspondence. 70 years of a reign, captured from every angle. But inside the family, it had also created something more fragile, a collection of moments that belonged partly to history and partly to the people who had lived them. Elizabeth had grown uneasy about a quiet question: how much of a royal family's private life should ever be allowed to become public material? She understood that once those two worlds mixed, separating them again could become almost impossible. Sophie remembered the evening when concern became action. June 5, 2022, after the final Jubilee events had ended, the monarch asked her to remain behind at Windsor. No large meeting followed. No dramatic announcement was made. Instead, Elizabeth was shown a short piece of informal family footage that had been copied into a wider production archive without her knowledge. The recording had been made in a private setting. It was never intended as public material. Yet there it sat, among content that could one day be reviewed for broader use. Elizabeth watched for only a few seconds before asking for it to stop. Anger never surfaced. Disappointment did. She told Sophie that celebration could never become permission to erase the family's final private boundaries. And the trusted companion understood in that moment that the problem was larger than one recording. If one intimate moment could drift unnoticed into a production collection, then letters, conversations, and other personal memories could eventually face the same fate. The Queen acted that night. She instructed that a formal custodial directive be prepared, covering unpublished Jubilee footage, private correspondence, and personal recordings. A custodial directive, in simple terms, is a written instruction controlling how protected royal material can be handled, copied, or released. Elizabeth wanted especially strict limits placed on independent commercial or biographical projects, because those productions would sit beyond direct palace control once material was released. Days later, Sophie witnessed the completed document being sealed. Elizabeth told her quietly that it should remain untouched unless circumstances made silence impossible. At the time, that instruction had seemed distant, almost abstract. It did not seem abstract anymore. Charles listened as she finished the account, and he understood why Harry's request had triggered the old instructions so precisely. His son had unknowingly walked into the exact situation his mother had feared. The past had spoken, and it spoke with uncomfortable clarity. But Harry was waiting in the present. And when father and son finally faced one another, neither was prepared to surrender his belief about what Elizabeth had truly intended. There are arguments that begin loudly. There are arguments made more dangerous by how quietly they start. Harry entered expecting an explanation. Charles was already seated, the sealed directive beside him. For several seconds, neither man spoke. And then the Duke asked the question that turned a dispute over archive access into something far more painful: was his father following the Queen's wishes or hiding behind them? Charles did not answer immediately. He turned the relevant page toward his son and allowed him to read the restriction. The original document was not to leave the room or be photographed, because the directive was part of protected royal custody. The palace remained responsible for controlling the original paper and everything connected to it. The king explained that Harry's request had been suspended because those conditions had been triggered, not because the footage belonged to him personally. Harry leaned forward and refused to let the issue become technical. The film, he said, was meant as a tribute, not an attack. The memories of his grandmother belonged emotionally to him, too. He had known Elizabeth as family before the world knew her as history. And being denied access felt less like a rule and more like another sign that leaving royal life had changed which parts of his own past he was still allowed to touch. The tension finally broke. Harry pushed his chair back and asked whether there would ever be a request from him that did not first pass through suspicion. Charles kept his voice low. Trust, he answered, could not be separated from consequences simply because family was involved. Then the monarch admitted something he had avoided saying: every decision involving his son now seemed to carry two dangers. Refuse, and the distance between them might widen again. Agree, and another private family boundary could disappear. Harry turned his anger toward Sophie, but Charles stopped him there. Sophie had not written the directive, requested it, or shaped its wording. She had preserved it because Elizabeth had asked her to. The revelation removed one easy target, but it left the Queen's instruction standing exactly where it had been. Harry asked the obvious question next: could his father simply overrule it? Charles acknowledged that the Crown gave him enormous authority. But overriding a direct custodial wish from Elizabeth for a private project would turn a family favor into an institutional breach of trust. He would not make that choice alone. The King ordered a formal reading of the directive's remaining provisions, with Sophie present. Harry had entered believing his father was the obstacle. Minutes later, he understood that the real barrier had been built years before either of them entered that room. Power had shifted away from the argument and toward the words Elizabeth left behind. Harry had come believing Charles could simply unlock the archive if he chose. Now, that certainty was collapsing. And beneath it lay a harder truth: authority was not only about what the King could do, but what he was willing to override when the request came from his own son. The clauses were read aloud. The Royal Archives separated public Jubilee material from restricted private records. Footage already released to the public could be used far more freely. Informal recordings, family correspondence, and personal exchanges remained protected. Harry's requested material fell into that private category. Elizabeth's instruction also demanded a privacy review and custodial authorization before anything restricted could leave archival control. In simple terms, someone responsible for protecting the material had to approve its use and confirm that private family boundaries would remain intact. Sophie sat opposite the King while the wording continued. Her hands stayed folded, but when Elizabeth's exact instruction was repeated, she lowered her eyes for a moment. She remembered the private conversation that had placed this responsibility on her. She had never wanted to become the person standing between father and son. But refusing to produce the document now would have meant betraying the very trust that gave it meaning. Charles understood the trap completely. Granting Harry an exception might ease one family wound, but it would also demonstrate that Elizabeth's restrictions could be set aside whenever emotional pressure became strong enough. Once he crossed that line, the directive would stop being a boundary and become little more than a suggestion. Then Sophie produced one final piece from the sealed packet. A handwritten covering note instructed the custodian to resist emotional urgency whenever a request arrived under intense family pressure or tight timing. The words landed heavily. Harry's application had been last minute by design. What had once looked like unfortunate timing now matched the warning with almost painful precision. Charles reached for his pen and signed the instruction refusing release of the private Jubilee recordings and correspondence. At the same time, he authorized Harry to use already public archival footage for the commemorative film. The compromise was clear. The tribute could proceed. The protected memories would remain exactly where Elizabeth intended. The King had made the decision, but relief never came. And before the signed refusal could even reach Harry properly, word of the halted request began moving quietly between people close to both sides. The directive had settled who controlled the material. It had done nothing to settle the pain. The rejection did not arrive with shouting, threats, or ceremony. It arrived as a short written decision, and somehow that made it hurt more. Harry read the page once, then again, searching for a sentence that might leave room for negotiation. There was none. The private material would remain sealed. And for the first time, the fight felt less like an argument he could win and more like a boundary that had existed long before he made the request. Archive staff had been told to stop preparing the private Jubilee footage and correspondence for review. Any working copies already identified were returned to restricted custody. Charles had left one narrow path open: public speeches, official photographs, ceremonial footage, and previously cleared broadcast material could still be used in the film. But the recordings and letters tied to Elizabeth's protected private life were no longer part of the discussion. The Duke set the paper down and moved away without speaking. His anger did not disappear. It changed shape. Appealing directly to his father had changed nothing, and that realization carried more weight than the refusal itself. He had entered the dispute believing that one conversation might unlock the door. Now he knew the door had been closed by a decision made years earlier. Sophie felt the cost from another direction. Alone after the refusal was confirmed, she wondered whether keeping faith with the Queen had cost the family another chance at healing. She knew she had followed Elizabeth's instruction exactly. But duty offered little comfort when the consequence was another fracture between father and son. She had protected the boundary. She could not protect them from what that boundary might do. Then Harry surprised everyone. Instead of attacking Sophie, he sent a direct private message stating that he did not blame her for producing the directive. His dispute, he said, was now with the principle itself. The idea that private family memory could be controlled by rules, even when the person asking was part of that family. Charles heard that message differently. He did not take it as surrender, but he recognized restraint where he had expected fury. For the first time, he sensed that his son might understand the document had never been created as a weapon against him. That small shift was enough. Charles asked to see Harry once more. This time, there were no folders, no advisors, no archive officials, no formal language between them. The paperwork had done all the damage it could do. Now only father and son could decide whether that damage became permanent. When Harry returned, the directive was nowhere on the table. There were no lawyers beside Charles, no aides waiting nearby, no Sophie there to explain what she had carried. For the first time since the request began, father and son faced each other without the monarchy standing between them. Nothing about the archive decision had changed. But almost immediately, the conversation itself began to feel different. Charles made that clear first. The decision over the protected material was final, he said. But the family conversation did not have to end with it. He had removed the documents for a reason. This meeting was no longer about custodial rules or official approval. It was about what the refusal had meant to both of them, and why something connected to Elizabeth had reopened wounds neither man had managed to close. Harry finally explained what he had wanted from the project. The private material mattered because he wanted his children to understand their great-grandmother as more than a sovereign. To the world, Elizabeth had been the reigning monarch. To him, she had also been a woman with private humor, affection, habits, and warmth that official broadcasts could never capture. Public footage preserved history. He wanted something that preserved family. The pain came next. Harry admitted that the refusal had initially felt like another message that he no longer belonged inside the family's shared memory. He spoke without shouting, which made the words land harder. Charles listened without interrupting. The accusation hurt because the king understood exactly what his son was saying. Exclusion from an archive could easily feel like exclusion from the past itself. Charles answered as a father rather than a monarch. Protecting a boundary left by Elizabeth, he said, was not the same as removing Harry from her life. Memories did not become less real simply because a camera could not reproduce them. And then he offered something the archive never could. He proposed giving Harry copies of several already cleared family photographs, and recording his own private recollections of Elizabeth, specifically for Harry's children. Those recordings would never enter the film. They would belong only to the family. Harry remained silent for several moments. Then the resistance finally shifted. He said he would withdraw the disputed portion of his request. He did not pretend to agree with every restriction. But he stopped challenging the sealed directive itself. That private breakthrough never left the room. Outside, a very different version was already taking shape. The story moving through the press was simpler, sharper, and far more explosive. Charles had blocked Harry after Sophie produced a secret royal directive. Inside, the conflict had softened. Outside, it was about to erupt. By morning, the private breakthrough had disappeared beneath a much harsher public story. Harry's name was everywhere again. Charles was being described as the father who had stopped his son. And Sophie had suddenly become the woman whose sealed document changed the outcome. The quiet understanding reached behind closed doors was invisible, and that gap between what happened privately and what the world believed made the fallout more dangerous. Charles saw the first wave of coverage and understood immediately how much had been lost in translation. The public version focused on three simple elements: Harry's last-minute request, the king's intervention, and Sophie's production of a sealed directive linked to Elizabeth's Jubilee archive. In plain language, a royal directive is simply a formal written instruction carrying the monarch's authority. But outside the palace, that explanation did little to soften the story. To many people, it looked like another barrier had been placed between Harry and his family's past. The debate split quickly. Some saw Charles as protecting Elizabeth's privacy, defending a boundary she had deliberately created. Others saw Harry as a grandson being shut out of family history by the same institution he had already left behind. Sophie found herself dragged into both versions. She had never asked to become the face of the decision. Yet her name was now attached to the moment almost as strongly as the king's. In a documented private conversation with a senior household figure, she insisted that she had not defeated Harry and that she had not won anything. She had kept a promise to Elizabeth. That distinction mattered deeply to her, because duty had already cost enough without being turned into personal triumph. Harry did not retaliate. No statement attacking Charles appeared. No public accusation targeted Sophie. His silence surprised those expecting another royal exchange, but the king understood what it meant. The argument over access was over. What remained was the deeper question: what exactly had the family protected by saying no? In the end, nobody got everything they wanted. Harry did not receive the private Jubilee recordings. Charles did not escape the pain of refusing his son. Sophie did not walk away untouched after carrying a promise that suddenly became public. Yet the sealed directive achieved exactly what Elizabeth had intended. It forced the family to separate the right to remember someone they loved from the right to control every private piece of that person's life. Harry formally withdrew his request for the restricted Platinum Jubilee material. The unpublished recordings and private correspondence remained sealed under the custodial rules Elizabeth had left behind. And because the decision was no longer aimed at one person, it became a standard applied to the entire protected collection. Harry's commemorative project could still use public Jubilee footage, approved photographs, speeches, and material already cleared for release. But the intimate archive would remain beyond the production. Charles met Sophie afterward with none of the tension that had surrounded their earlier conversations. He thanked her for producing the directive, even though she knew how painful the consequences might become. She answered quietly that protecting the Queen's wishes only had meaning if she was willing to protect them when doing so became difficult. Her burden had not disappeared. But for the first time, it no longer felt like something she carried alone. Harry left with something different from the access he originally wanted. Before departing, he told Charles that he still wished the answer had been yes. He did not hide that disappointment. But he also admitted that he no longer believed the refusal had been designed to erase him from the family's shared past. The king understood how important that distinction was. It did not repair every fracture between them. But it ended this confrontation without another public attack or private act of retaliation. Elizabeth's directive had revealed its deeper purpose. What had first looked like a restriction was actually a boundary against turning every private royal memory into public property. Charles made that principle permanent by ordering the same privacy standard to remain attached to the protected Jubilee collection. Harry was not uniquely punished, and he was not quietly exempted. The rules survived the emotions that surrounded them. Charles proved that kingship can sometimes mean denying the person one most wants to reconcile with. Harry proved that disappointment does not have to become destruction. Sophie proved that loyalty can look harsh when a promise is finally tested. And Elizabeth's final instruction left the clearest message of all: royal history may belong to the nation, but private love does not automatically belong to the public. The request was halted. The archive remained sealed. And the argument ended without victory celebrations. What survived was quieter and more important: a boundary honored, a promise kept, and one rare moment when the House of Windsor chose restraint over another rupture.